The latest Final Fantasy XIV expansion, Endwalker, was set to conclude multiple storylines that began over 10 years ago. A payoff that players have long been waiting for, and once finished would set the stage for the next 10 years of Final Fantasy XIV. If A Realm Reborn was meant to save a franchise at risk, Endwalker was a victory lap, and fan expectation was at a fever pitch. The COVID pandemic threatened to throw a last-minute wrench into the plans as global video game development became severely impacted by work-from-home policies. But like the heroes of Final Fantasy XIV itself, the developers found the will to persevere through a global calamity to deliver on a long-awaited conclusion.
I didn't intend to write the pandemic like as is and try to depict it as is, but I imagined that people playing this game would have felt the impact of the coronavirus, and how fear spreads is something I'm sure people can relate to and understand that, oh yeah, these scary incidents. There were some thought put into how those scenes were depicted, for sure.
And I've had enough of this rabble! Come on!
Demand for Endwalker was so high leading up to the next expansion, Square Enix had to halt sales of the game entirely, just so existing players could log into the game without dealing with the queue. Famously, it wasn't always this way. In 2010, Square Enix released Final Fantasy XIV, its second ever Final Fantasy MMO, after a successful run with Final Fantasy XI. 14 bombed. Hard. Critically, the MMO was panned across the board, and only its loyal fanbase kept Final Fantasy XIV's from becoming a complete disaster. But there was a belief that the game could be great, enough so that the team and newly appointed producer and director Naoki Yoshida and his team spent 3 years on a new version called A Realm Reborn, which would essentially wipe away the original FF14, incorporate its destruction into the game's lore, and, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, A Realm Reborn would become not only a successful, but a beloved Final Fantasy game considered by some to be one of the best in the franchise.
Looking back at it, I think by 2020, we already started thinking about what our framework of our narrative is going to be, and how we're going to be laying out our plot. So I think that's when we started looking at the story for sure.
Final Fantasy XIV is an MMORPG, so its developers are constantly thinking about the next steps in a theoretically infinite storyline. But the feeling was that Endwalker could serve as some kind of finale, even a temporary one.
I wanted to bring a finale to this arc as we were creating the expansion, and while we were working on Shadowbringers, our previous expansion, I was already having to think about, okay, where am I going to take this?
Make no mistake, Endwalker is not the end of Final Fantasy XIV as a game, but the chance to write any kind of finale for an MMORPG is a monumental feat on its own.
Of course, with an MMORPG, it is assumed that the story will continue and there is no end to it. So being able to close a chapter on this was quite fortunate for me as a writer, of games that start to drop in popularity and players kind of leave and they have to be canceled. So could have very well happened with our game as well. And so it's such a blessing that I was able to conclude the story and being able to follow through with writing the end of the story.
Considering how close the fans are to the game, key members of the Final Fantasy XIV development team have obtained rockstar status, and Endwalker was set to be led by an all-star team. The main scenario and lore were being overseen by Natsuko Ishikawa and Banri Oda, longtime Final Fantasy XIV writers for the previous expansion Shadowbringers, Final Fantasy XIV's most critically acclaimed expansion to date.
When thinking about writing Endwalker, I had set myself a bar, a hurdle that I want to reach and to surpass. I think trying to get myself to achieve that goal was the biggest struggle. To be able to write a story that continues for multiple years, being a sort of writer who is working on a game primarily, is an experience that you don't get to experience very often. So I was actually quite happy. I get to participate in writing this and in a conclusion to this story. So I was really happy about that.
There was also a literal rockstar on the team, Masayoshi Soken, who would once again be in charge of adding yet another iconic soundtrack to Final Fantasy's legacy. While the COVID-19 pandemic threatened Endwalker's development, like developers around the globe, the team learned to adapt to the new normal.
There were those who stood in defiance of that fate.
In April 2020, Tokyo announced a state of emergency as COVID-19 hit Japan, and suddenly, the team was faced with the unknown challenge of developing a multi-million-dollar expansion from home. However, the pandemic didn't just affect Endwalker's development, it also changed its story. In Endwalker, our heroes prepare for a series of final battles that will determine the fate of their world. Along with battling godlike beings, a mysterious calamity known as the End of Days was spreading through the continent, turning fearful citizens into monsters, almost like a virus.
それこそ2020年くらいのコロナの
When the first waves of the coronavirus hit and we had faced our first lockdown, the world was kind of confused and in panic. That was the time when I was going in and sort of making adjustments to the overall story of Endwalker. And considering the original story that I was thinking at that time, and imagining this story would be seen by people who experienced this worldwide pandemic, I felt that it was a little too optimistic, or it seems like it seemed a little fuzzy, and it felt as if though it's not really grounded in reality.
Since A Realm Reborn, Masayoshi Soken has led the music of Final Fantasy XIV. Even among his peers, Soken's rock-forward compositions give the music of Final Fantasy XIV a punk rocker's bite, and lyrically, Final Fantasy XIV's soundtrack is geared towards overcoming trials and tribulations.
For the future of Eolia!
The pandemic gave Soken a chance to address the global crisis directly.
まさにその Lost in the Distance
In the game, there is a certain part where you have this physical distance with your sort of allies that you've been traveling with, but you still feel them. And I think it's meant to give off that atmosphere of like you can't see them, they're not physically next to you, but you can still feel their presence and you know that they're still watching over you. And I feel that that song really brings out that sort of merging or meshing of that situation with the song and how the atmosphere of that song plays out. And I think it describes this situation with the pandemic really well, where we have this game, and although people might not be physically playing like with each other where you can see each other, but you're still connected. You feel very connected, and then you can still share an experience.
現実世界で起こっていることを、
I think if I'm asked if some of these elements that happen in real life kind of overlap with what happens in the game, yeah, that is very true. There are situations when that happens. And we mentioned the coronavirus pandemic. There were also various other disasters that happened in Japan right after or right around the time of A Realm Reborn coming out. Japan had suffered the tsunami and earthquake that hit the eastern part of Japan islands. So that definitely made an impact in the game as well.
Contrary to what you might think, the loss of the office was not necessarily the greatest casualty of the pandemic. It was the loss of a vital piece of the puzzle in the Final Fantasy XIV ecosystem, the direct line of communication between its developers and its fans. Final Fantasy XIV's strength is its community. Every few years, Square Enix hosts a live in-person event called FanFest, where its developers deliver new updates and announcements live to fans from around the globe. In 2020, the planned FanFest was cancelled. Instead, the team shifted, like they did with the development of the game, and announced an all-digital event that would be streamed around the world.
でもちろんそのデジタルファンフェスでも
That was definitely different when we decided to do a digital fan festival. It was definitely a quality that you wouldn't be able to experience in a digital fan festival. Of course, I'm sure people had a lot of fun with the digital fan festival, but I would have loved to see people face to face.
コロナ禍が始まる前に、私は
So before the corona pandemic hit, there were various occasions where I would go to promotional events, including Gamescom in Germany or the PAX events, PAX East, PAX West. And when I did that, I felt that regardless of being in a different part of the world or coming from a different country or a different culture, we can still talk about and discuss on a common theme, on one common theme. And it's natural when you see people around you, close to you, having different opinions or different requests. But finding out that you travel across the ocean and you find people who have the same opinion as you or the same sort of desires as you, and realizing that, wow, that can actually happen is something very interesting. And I think because I had that sort of realization, I was able to sort of convey that in the story of Endwalker. And that's how the story turned out for that conclusion. Now, if I did not have that realization, the Heidelin Zodiac saga may have ended differently.
While fans tuned in from their homes, the developers did their best to create a show that was enjoyable for all. Yoshida-san came out dressed as one of the new jobs coming to Endwalker, and developers shared stories, conducted interviews, and told eager fans to look forward to Endwalker. The highlight of the show was no doubt a live concert performance by Soken-san, who appeared on stage to put on a performance for the ages.
And my feelings when I took that stage was, of course, it was unfortunate. The physical event was canceled and we had to pivot to another format, with 2021 being a digital fan festival. But until we were able to do this digital event, we would have these events in each of our region. And this is like in a literal global, like everywhere on the earth you can log in and watch. And I think that was very interesting and very exciting for me. And being on stage and looking at the chat, the comments that flowed in, and seeing so many different languages scroll through, and it was scrolling really fast because there were a lot of people commenting, and like, wow. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's crazy, something crazy is happening.
すごくなんか印象的でした。
So we are all in it together, wanting to enjoy this fan event together. And I felt that sort of passion kind of overflowed from the screen as I was watching this.
On December 7th, Endwalker was finally released on PC and PlayStation consoles. For weeks, servers couldn't keep up with demands as players rushed to experience the highly anticipated conclusion. Queues were congested, and Square Enix announced that it would halt the sale of Final Fantasy XIV for new players so that existing players could finish their decade-long journey.
I do have a very good sense of satisfaction that I was able to do what I set out to do. And it's a very strong feeling of like this accomplishment. We also don't have the time to sit on our laurels, so to speak, and to kind of soak around in our joy, so to speak. We are already busy on production of 6.1, and as you may be aware, we need to start developing a new story.
Endwalker did indeed deliver on the promise of a conclusion, albeit a temporary one, despite the troubles it faced. The fates of Heidelin and Zodiac were resolved, and Eorzea's future was restored. More tantalizingly, Endwalker flung the doors wide open for years and years of Final Fantasy XIV stories still to be told.
I
think it's really good that there is this relationship between developers and the players, and it allows us for 14 to continue being what it is. The players also play a strong role in the communication with us developers, and so again, I want to reemphasize that let us continue to enjoy Final Fantasy XIV, and let us continue to build this game together.
いいゲームを一緒に作っていこう。
なんだろう、エンドウォーカーみたいなタイトルつけて、ハイデリンゾディアーク編。
And I'm sure players out there are wondering, oh wait, with Endwalker ending everything, what's going to happen next? What our challenge now is to kind of explore what new ideas that we have and sort of bring an answer to those questions that players may have. Like, how do we bring about a new sort of narrative? And I would love for this to be a collaborative effort. I would love for the players to continue their communication with us developers so that we can take on these new challenges. And I would love for players to continue to see the fruits of our labor. And beyond that, I'm sure we'll have another fan festival where we can get together. And it was a lot of fun watching all the comments stream and that was really cool. So I think again, it's a very collaborative effort, and we're building Final Fantasy XIV together. And I wish that relationship with the players will continue.
The COVID-19 pandemic impacted everyone around the world, halting most people in their tracks. In that stasis, it was difficult to imagine a future when everything was so uncertain. While the road to recovery is slow and painful, there were many valuable lessons we learned. And in the process of adapting to the new normal, developers like the ones at Square Enix were able to incorporate these lessons into both the Endwalker expansion and the FanFest, which the team holds so dearly.